Welcome to our podcast Arquitectura a Pata, Architecture on Foot in an English version. This is a special episode for us as it marks our first venture into English. We hope our listeners will enjoy it. This is the 11th episode of our 4th season on common spaces, which was produced by Maria del Mar Caicedo and myself, Andres Felipe Rodriguez. We were inspired by the importance of habitat as a fundamental right in our cities, which are facing challenges such as climate change and globalization. We set out to explore the diversity of perspectives and solutions related to the configuration and use of public spaces. Through 16 interviews with national and international experts, we sought to understand how the design and management of these spaces can influence the quality of life of people and the construction of more inclusive and sustainable communities. In this episode, we had the privilege of interviewing Sue Jean Chung, an architect who earned her Bachelor of Architecture from the University of Toronto. Sue Jean is a founding principal of Studio JCI, an innovative multidisciplinary practice based in Toronto, Canada, focusing on residential and mixed-use urban developments. Sue Jean's philosophy emphasizes the importance of thoughtful architecture design at both the macro and micro levels to create spaces that promote well-being and functionality within their contexts. She is committed to sharing her wealth of knowledge and experience with the architecture and design community through initiatives like JCI Learn, a lecture series she established to mentor emerging architects like us. Her topics span from conceptualization to the artistic details of construction drawings. We were eager to delve into Sue Jean's insights regarding her experience in a context like Toronto and how the practice of architecture is impacted by the current housing crisis in Canada. Our conversation began with a fundamental question: what was the role of public space in the past and how has it evolved over time?
So I think for city building, public space is critical. It's a place where community happens. It's a place where people can collect and gather. It's a resting place between all the built forms, and especially in larger city centers where there's development, there's towers, there's high rises, and there's very limited street and sidewalk space. Then these public spaces become very important nodes for people to collect and gather. I'm from Toronto, Canada. I live in the city of Toronto. There's a lot of hardscape as well, lots of sidewalks, lots of roads. And while we do our best to put trees on these major avenues, sometimes that green space is also limited. So having these public spaces, whether they are in the form of parks or courtyards, or there's something even called a POP, privately owned public space. So this is where, say, a larger condo developer has a big piece of land, but they don't build over their entire land. So we have one project in Burlington that has a POPs. So the ground floor takes maybe 2/3 of the lot area, and the remaining third is devoted as a POPs. So this is privately owned. It's not given to the city. The developer is the one that's responsible for creating the space and maintaining the space, but it's accessible to all the public. It's not an exclusive use to the residents of the development. And so there's different ways that public spaces are being integrated now, whether they are city-owned parcels of land or whether they are privately owned parcels of land.
Her perspective on public space is so interesting. We could see the similarities that exist in different geographical contexts regarding issues such as this, and the strategies that are used to provide public spaces to the city, a fundamental right of citizenship. But well, we wanted to delve deeper into her life and professional experience that she has had on the subject of public space. This is what she said.
There are two main projects that I could highlight. Both tend to be near some sort of body of water. So as I mentioned in my previous, we have one project where there is a privately owned public space or a POPs. And that is right at the end of very dynamic waterfront area in the city of Burlington. And so I went by that area last summer. Super busy vibrant, lots of people, whether they're biking, rollerblading, families with strollers and young kids, people with their dogs. There was a festival happening, so there was a big stage set up, and you can see just how much that brings a community together. So this development that's right beside it will be an opportunity to extend that public area or that public realm. I could easily see people who are walking along the waterfront continuing, grabbing a coffee, sitting with a friend when the weather is nice outside, and enjoying the space. So that's one of our projects. Another project is in a small town in Southern Ontario called Napanee. So this is a typical Ontario small town. It's not very big. And our client purchased an old furniture factory called Gibberts, and they are revitalizing that whole area to create 2 towers plus a restoration in addition to an existing mill building. And it happens to be right beside the Napanee River. And what we did is we created a plaza in between the 2 buildings. And so this is something that didn't exist at all before, that now we are creating. And because of the scale and size of this development relative to the scale and size of the small town, this is a huge transformation to this small town, where there's going to be this very large plaza that overlooks the river, that engages people from the street. The town has planned for other walkway trails along the river as well. And so this is now really going to become a central node in this small town. It's something that's really exciting. And on top of that, outside of the public space aspects, this is an exciting project for us because the river has a small waterfall. So the client is going to be purchasing turbine engines to actually create electricity next to this project and actually sell it back to the city. They are also using another sustainable technology called geothermal, which will also improve the energy efficiency of the building. And they are considering using photovoltaic, so solar power. So in the end, not only will this project bring public space and revitalize a small town, but we're hoping that this project will become net positive, basically creating more energy than it is actually using. And so that is a very exciting project for us at our office. It's currently under construction. And we anticipate once this project is done, there will be a lot more animation down by the riverfront, which currently doesn't exist. I think the geographical context is really important to consider. And that is maybe why in some places in Southern Ontario, there isn't as much public space. We're a little bit more north of the equator than Colombia, and we are definitely colder than Spain. So we have winters to deal with. Winters are not very fun unless you like doing winter sports. And there's also fall and spring, which tends to have a lot of rain or weather that's unstable. So on any given day in the month of March, we can be as cold as -10, and we can be as warm as +15 degrees Celsius. And so obviously, if it's that cold, how people use public space and how they interact with public space will be different. But we're also Canadians, and so sometimes we've learned to adapt. A lot of public spaces will also incorporate things like ice rinks. So our city hall or spaces downtown, or there's another place in downtown Toronto where we have a major highway called the Gardiner, and then directly below it, they revitalize that area to this place called the Bentway. And in the wintertime, they have this ice skating track that you can go around in a circle, and it goes in and through the piers of the elevated expressway. And so there's been ways that we've looked into incorporating the cold and embracing the cold in some of these public spaces. Those tend to be more civic type of spaces, so city. I have yet to see a private developer do an ice rink, but those are some of the ways that we would consider the geographic context. Having overhangs is also important. When we have tall buildings, especially, there's another geographical consideration called wind. When you have a lot of wind, like a lot of tall buildings, then in between the buildings, the wind will get stronger. And so we need to make sure there's proper overhangs or windscreens to ensure that it's still somewhat comfortable. So geographic context does make a big difference in terms of the spatial qualities of the public space. And then obviously safety for the public realm needs to be considered. When I was young, growing up, there were a lot of parks in the city of Toronto that were in hilly areas. So one of my favorite pastimes was tobogganing. So we would bring our sled to the hill and we would go toboggan down these hills. One interesting thing now, when I go back to some of these places, due to safety, some of these hills have been closed off. So that's one of the areas where sometimes the public space changes over time based on the expectations of the current culture or the generation. But definitely it's trying to find 4 seasons approach to public spaces. There's been other places where they open up things like Christmas markets, and they'll have extra heaters outside to really animate the space. And so having these public spaces, while they may not be used as much in the wintertime, there are still uses for them. They don't become completely vacant areas that nobody gets attracted to.
So, expecting changes is what we can anticipate for the public spaces, according to the culture and conditions of time. We wanted to know how she thought her architecture transforms landscapes, cities, and communities. This is what she answered.
There's different layers to consider. One is the planning context. So the city of Toronto has a zoning bylaw, and our province of Ontario has an official plan. Or actually, city of Toronto has an official plan. So there are certain documents that say when you build along major avenues or roads or in the downtown area, you're allowed to build a certain height. Then you've got other areas where there are smaller neighborhoods, more residential, single-family homes. And so that would have a different type of context. One of the things that's important for us to understand as architects is what is the context in terms of a planning policy point of view. How tall are you allowed to build? No one would build a 6-story tower in the middle of single-family home area where all the buildings are 2 stories, right? And likewise, if we were downtown, we would not build a 4-story building. It would be 40 stories at least. And so understanding the plan context is the first step in creating the architecture to fit that form. The other thing is understanding the site constraints. Sometimes because, especially in the city of Toronto, if it's downtown or midtown, you have very limited lot areas. And most developers want to maximize their lot area. And so it's understanding then how to create the interface between what's happening on the street and the sidewalk versus what is happening inside the building. The city of Toronto also has different streetscape design guidelines. So there are several projects we've had where the original property line is set, but then the city wants to widen the road or widen, the overall roadway so that there's more room for bicycles and trees and benches. And so that's one of the areas where at a smaller scale, the public realm is increased, where previously it was just maybe a 2.5 meter sidewalk. Now it will be a 3.5 or 4 meter sidewalk with bike lanes, benches, a nice, sidewalk width, trees and whatnot. So those are all the different ways that we as architects can engage with enhancing the public realm. But from our end, what we can advise our clients is about what's the appropriate built form. Another thing that happens often in residential units or residential buildings there is a requirement for amenity space. So while this may not be publicly accessible, it's something that's accessible to the end users. And these amenity spaces can be both indoor or outdoor. And it becomes then a microcosm of public space, where it's not public for the entire city, but it's a public space for the benefit of all the residents of a building. And those come in the form of rooftop terraces, outdoor workout spaces like an outdoor gym, co-working lounges available indoor and outdoor, pet facilities. So we had one project with a dog area on the rooftop. So all the residents can bring their dogs upstairs to socially interact with other dog owners and whatnot. So those are some of the opportunities that we do have as architects, but probably the thing that defines it most clearly would be the planning policies and what you're allowed to build.
These were some examples of the various policies and requirements for communal spaces in residential buildings, such as amenity spaces and public-private spaces designed to foster community within the building. Additionally, if you are an architect who wants to submit a project to be approved by the city, you have to demonstrate how the building is connected to the city and what contributions it makes to the public space, and you have to show this in the floor site plans. It's so interesting to see other countries' policies and enrich the ones we have in other contexts. After this explanation, we wanted to see what's next for these kinds of spaces, and this is what Sue Jean told us.
I think they should always, first of all, they're critical pieces, so we definitely do need more. The challenge becomes who pays for it, in one sense. Public spaces require some maintenance. So there's public spaces that are owned by the city, and then there's private spaces that are given access to the public. I think it's really important to ensure that there's equity in the public spaces so that it's available for everybody. It shouldn't be for just a select demographic or type of people. And currently, for instance, in Toronto, there's one contentious project, not one of ours, but it's a parcel of downtown land that is owned by the province. And it is currently a completely public space. And there were development plans to put a private water park there. And that is, for instance, one example of a public space that people have been arguing should remain completely public and not privatized. In the end, in Canada, we have a fairly short summer, maybe from middle of June to middle of September. And that's when everybody loves to go outside. And having these outdoor places is critical to keep the city vibrant versus forcing people to go outside of the city in order to enjoy a bit of nature. Toronto is a fantastic city. It's right by, a lake, so it's a port town in one sense. There is still quite a bit of a port industry in Toronto. Having access to lakefront water and some of those public spaces are really key. So what we've understood as a city is we actually need more public space. We need more green space. We need more opportunities to allow our city to naturally breathe. So this is now from a green perspective, making sure there's enough green space, enough natural features to reduce the concrete heat sink effect, to bring more cooling to the city, to provide biodiversity or maintain the biodiversity in our city areas. So there is definitely much more of a focus on ensuring all of these aspects are met.
We wanted to see, based on Sue Jean's approach to housing innovation in addressing housing problems, and of course the housing crisis there in Canada, how she thought public space could contribute solutions to that issue or be involved in it. This is what she answered.
The housing crisis here in Toronto or in Ontario, definitely there is a need for the public space. I think it's more, to answer your question, it's more about community and values. Maybe I will ask you a question, if I may. When it comes to in Bogota, or sorry, you're Bogota or?
I'm currently in Medellin, but...
Medellin, okay, so in Colombia.
Uh-huh.
How well do you know your neighbors?
Not so much.
In Toronto, there's this expression, or this, it's not really a saying, but people who live in small towns talk to everybody around them. They talk to their neighbors. They have that social community. People who live in big cities, because they're so crammed with everybody, they value their space, and so they tend to not talk with those around them, right? Whereas in the small town, people feel isolated because there's so much space between them that they naturally do want to talk. So Toronto is like that big city. There's lots of areas where people don't talk to their neighbors. They don't know their community. And some of the ways that the housing, Southern Ontario, they're called single family dwellings, which means it's a house that's meant for one family. When I first moved into our area, we bought our house, which was about almost 3,000 square feet from one person. She lived there, raised her family, her kids grew up, moved on, her husband passed away, so she was a widower. So one person living in a 3,000 square foot house. When we started meeting our neighbors, I was really surprised. A lot of them had been living there for 30 to 50 years. One person living in 2,500 to 3,000 square feet. So you can imagine the number of people per hectare in this sort of residential area is very low. Versus if you took that land area and put a condo on it, you would easily have 600 to 1,000 people living in that same lot area. So there really is a divide in terms of density and how that creates community. One of the goals of JCI and some of the developments that we're looking to do with respect to multi-unit residential is to create opportunities for community. It's a smaller scale development. So if you live in a multiplex, you now have just 2 or 3 other neighbors. You don't have 500 neighbors. And because it's a closer to ground type of dwelling unit, you share a driveway or you share a backyard, and there's more opportunities. The other thing that we're considering, and we'll see how it plays out, is how people live. Rent and real estate in Toronto is very expensive. And part of what makes the housing crisis.
The housing crisis in Canada is characterized by a shortage of affordable housing, skyrocketing prices, and increasing homelessness. This happens in major cities like Vancouver and Toronto. Contributing factors include rapid population growth, limited housing supply, and speculation in the real estate market. This crisis had led to overcrowding, unsafe living conditions, and housing insecurity for many Canadians, exacerbating inequality and social exclusion. Government efforts to address the crisis include initiatives to increase affordable housing supply, implement rent controls, and provide support for vulnerable populations. But as we have heard, more comprehensive and sustained action is needed to ensure access to safe and affordable housing for all. We will see what happens in the future. Just wanted you all to know what it is about. We think it is important to address other countries' issues and see what we can learn from them.
The housing crisis is because of how expensive it is. So most young 20, 30 somethings, they can't afford to buy a condo or they can't afford to buy a house. But living styles have changed. So now you would easily see 3 people renting a room in a 3-bedroom condo, and they just share the living area. We see a lot more multi-generational housing coming up where, a mother, like the grandparents, the parents, and their young children all live in the same building. One of our earlier projects, about 2 years ago, I believe it was completed, is a multi-generational house. So there was the grandchildren that hired us, their parents were living with them, and their grandparents. And it was, how do we create a house form, but make unique and distinct spaces so they all have their autonomy. But then when they do want to gather and have a big family dinner, they can do that. And so those are some of the ways that I think lifestyle is changing the context. The public space for residential ends up being that front yard, as long as there is, enough sort of green space. And it all depends on how the people choose to interact with their neighbors. So that's a tricky one, because creating the public space in front of a triplex will not necessarily create community. It's the values of the people living there. And generally, there are still nodes of community centers or parks, even within these residential zones, where people can collect.
Here we can learn and highlight the current way of living according to lifestyle, where private spaces offer the possibility to interact in communal areas. As Sue Jean mentioned, it is important to study the community and design spaces accordingly. Otherwise, an open space may not necessarily be used if it is not conceived properly and aligned with people's needs. And last but not least, we wanted to see what Sue Jean thought and can call attention to our context or another different context about public spaces. Here's what she told us.
I think what I would suggest is just valuing the importance of public space, but also creating connecting points between the public spaces. If there's a public space that is completely isolated, then getting there, there's different ways. But, what I've seen, over my travels as well is when there's like a long stretch of public space, in Barcelona, I believe it's Las Ramblas, right? A main strip which is a giant public space. It's part of a road system, but it connects to destinations, right? In New York, they converted an old railway line into something called the High Line Trail. So they made it into, grasses and a natural walking trail right in the middle of the city. And that's a connector. Similarly, in Seoul, Korea, they did something similar where they took an abandoned elevated train track and they turned it into a public walking area. I think understanding that, public spaces are great, but when you're able to elongate that or connect public spaces together, then it really does improve the area. In Toronto, as I mentioned, we're lakefront. So we have a very long waterfront public space, which is fantastic because you can go from the east end of the city all the way to the west end, and then you can go north, right? And engage in other public spaces adjacent to that. But having that as a connector really does allow for that to be another, there's points along that waterfront trail that are nodes, right? You can walk or bike or rollerblade for a little bit, and then you're at a marina, and then you bike or walk or jog a little bit more, and there's a pop-up festival happening. So those are all these opportunities where you can engage in something that you wouldn't have normally engaged. And so when there's something that's elongated, something that connects different public spaces, then I think that really helps, the overall vibrancy of a public space.
This conversation highlights the needs for innovative design solutions that prioritize affordability, sustainability, and inclusivity. We love that. Those really are priorities nowadays. Listen to her last comments about public space.
Public space is very important, I think, for the vitality of any city or urban fabric. And I would love to come down to Colombia one day and see how you guys do it. I feel like there's probably a lot we can learn from Colombia in terms of how spaces are, created, designed, and used. And so, definitely this is a great international topic of conversation because it applies to any type of city, whether you're in Europe, in North America, South America, anywhere.
Something we love about Sue Jean and Studio JCI is that they are focused on restoring the missing middle with alternative housing models such as mixed income development, co-housing, and tiny homes to create more equitable and resilient built environments. Of course, including public space, which shapes society, creates community while being sustainable. Thank you so much for listening. Comment and follow us in our Instagram and social media as Arquitectura Pata. Keep following us in our footsteps. Walk with us in the next episode of this 4th season, Common Spaces.